USS Essex was the lead ship of her class and ushered in a new era of naval aviation for the United States Navy. Finally free of the constricting pre-war limitation treaties, Essex was the unencumbered realization of 20 years of operational experience. Her machinery arrangement, armor protection, and anti-aircraft battery was greatly improved over that of the pre-war U.S. carriers. Essex also had better facilities for handling ammunition, greater fuel capacity, and more effective damage control equipment than her predecessors. In short, she was the right ship, at the right moment in time for the U.S. Navy to take the fight to the Japanese. Her keel was laid down on April 28, 1941, by the Newport News Shipbuilding Corporation, and she was launched a little over a year later on July 31, 1942. Essex had an overall length of 872 feet, a beam of 93 feet, and displaced over 27,000 tons when she was completed. Her flight deck was 862 feet long and 147 feet wide. The deck edge elevator, which had been experimented with on the original Wasp, became standard on the Essex class to go along with their two inboard elevators. This was a major innovation that greatly aided flight operations. Essex was equipped with two catapults for launching aircraft, one on her forward flight deck and another on her hangar deck. She was designed to carry an air group of 90 operational aircraft, 36 fighters, 36 dive bombers, and 18 torpedo bombers. Essex was powered by 8 oil-fired boilers that generated steam for 4 geared turbines, which each drove a shaft. Rated for 150,000 shaft horsepower, Essex was capable of 33 knots and had a range of over 14,000 nautical miles when cruising at 15 knots. For defense, Essex was equipped with 12 5-inch 38 caliber dual-purpose guns, 8 of which were located in 4 enclosed twin mounts located near her island on the starboard side. The other 4 were located in single open mounts on her port side, 2 forward and 2 aft. At the time of her commissioning, she was equipped with 9 quadruple 40mm mounts and 46 single-mounted 20mm Oerlikon autocannons. Her AA battery was updated continuously over the course of the war, and by late 1945, she had 11 quad 40 mounts and 65 Oerlikon mounts. As designed, Essex was manned by over 2,600 officers and enlisted men, including her embarked air wing. By the end of the Pacific War, all of the updates to her anti-aircraft battery had increased her complement to well over 3,000 men. Essex was commissioned into the U.S. Navy on December 31, 1942, and after her sea trials and shakedown cruise were completed, she headed for the Pacific in May of 1943. She spent June and July working up and patrolling Hawaiian waters before departing Pearl Harbor in mid-August for her first taste of combat. She joined Task Force 15, which included her sister Yorktown and the light carrier Independence, to strike Marcus Island on August 31st. At 5:20 that morning, Essex began launching her planes. Throughout the day, strike after strike was launched from the 3 carriers, and after 10 hours of attacks, Marcus Island was in shambles and shrouded in a pall of black smoke. In September, Essex was transferred and designated as the flagship of Task Force 14, which got underway on September 29th to raid Wake Island. Over the course of 2 days, October 5th and 6th, her pilots pounded the island before returning to Pearl Harbor. A month later, she took part in a strike on the Japanese fortress at Rabaul, alongside the carriers Bunker Hill and Independence. She then supported the amphibious assault at Tarawa Atoll a little over a week later, before attacking Kwajalein and Watje atolls in the Marshall Islands on December 4th. After these strikes, Essex retired to Pearl Harbor, where she spent the rest of the year resting and replenishing. Task Force 58 was created on January 6, 1944, and Essex was added to the roster of Task Group 58.2, along with Intrepid and the light carrier Cabot. The battleships North Carolina, South Dakota, and Alabama, along with a cruiser and 6 destroyers, made up her screen. On January 16th, the group got underway for operations in the Marshall Islands. Beginning on the 27th, her pilots struck targets throughout the Marshalls before concentrating on the island of Roy Namur on the 29th and 30th ahead of the landings there on February 1st. After retiring to replenish at Majuro on February 3rd, Essex's task group was underway again on the afternoon of the 12th to take part in Operation Hailstone, the U.S. Navy's massive attack on the Japanese base at Truk Atoll. For 2 days, beginning on February 17th, Essex's pilots pummeled Truk Atoll, helping to sink 16 Japanese naval vessels, including 3 light cruisers, 4 destroyers, and 9 auxiliary vessels. In addition to these losses, 19 cargo ships and 5 tankers were also sunk, and more than 250 Japanese planes were heavily damaged or destroyed. For a more in-depth review of Operation Hailstone, check out the link in the description below to a previous video I did about the entire operation. After Hailstone, Essex and her task group retired to Majuro before departing for Pearl Harbor on the 25th, where Essex was detached for an overhaul at the Mare Island Navy Yard. With her overhaul completed, she was back at Majuro on May 15th with Air Group 15, nicknamed the Fabled 15, embarked. Commanding the Fabled 15 was Commander David McCampbell, who would end up as the Navy's ace of aces with 34 confirmed aerial victories by war's end. While Air Group 15 was embarked on Essex from April to November 1944, they destroyed more enemy planes, 315 in the air and 348 on the ground, and sank more enemy ships than any other air group in the U.S. Navy. Essex struck Marcus and Wake Islands again from May 19th through the 23rd before returning to Majuro, where she was reassigned to Task Group 58.4 for Operation Forager, the conquest of the Mariana Islands. Her task group departed Majuro on June 6th, and on the 11th commenced their operations by attacking and sinking 14 ships of a convoy they found off Saipan. The next day, another Japanese convoy was ravaged by planes from her task group, and on the 13th her pilots struck Japanese positions and installations throughout Saipan and Tinian before the task group retired to refuel. After refueling, 58.4 headed north with 58.1 to strike the Bonin Islands. On the 18th, the 2 task groups rushed south to rejoin the rest of Task Force 58 for a showdown with the Japanese mobile fleet. The Battle of the Philippine Sea, or the Great Marianas Turkey Shoot as it would become known, began early on the morning of the 19th of June, when Japanese planes from their bases on Guam attempted to form up for an attack on Task Force 58. 30 Hellcats were vectored in and made quick work of them, downing 35 of the would-be attackers for the loss of 1 Hellcat. But this was just the beginning, as just before 10 a.m., Japanese aircraft were picked up on radar approaching the fleet from the west. The fighters over Guam were recalled, and at 10:23 Task Force 58 turned into the wind and launched every available fighter plane. All of the task force's bomber aircraft, which were armed and fueled for the day's strikes, were launched as well and sent to orbit open waters to the east, rather than leaving them in hangar decks where they would be vulnerable to Japanese bombs. By the time Essex's deck was clear, the Japanese were about 70 miles out. However, they began circling to regroup their formations for the attack, and this 10-minute delay would prove to be a critical mistake for them, as it allowed the first group of Hellcats from Essex to meet them in essentially the same spot, 70 miles out at 10:36. Within minutes, Essex's pilots had claimed 20 Japanese aircraft against the loss of only 1 Hellcat. The Japanese that survived this encounter were soon met by fighters from other carriers, and 21 more were promptly sent spinning into graveyard spirals. The 27 aircraft that remained attacked Admiral Willis Lee's battleship group, which had been deployed 15 miles to the west of the carrier groups. No Japanese aircraft of the first wave got through to attack the American carrier groups. Just after 11, radars throughout Task Force 58 began to detect the second wave. Once again, Essex's Hellcats were the first on the scene. Led by Commander McCampbell, they met the second wave 72 miles out at 11:39 and began to tear into them. It was all over in a matter of minutes. McCampbell splashed 5 himself, and the rest of VF-15 accounted for 13 more, and again all for the loss of a single Hellcat. 43 Hellcats from other carriers soon piled in, and altogether, at least 70 of the 109 Japanese aircraft from this wave were shot down by the U.S. fighter screen. Essex pilots played no part in the third wave, which came in from the north around 1 p.m. The fourth strike wave, which was picked up on radar around 1:30, was the weakest of the day, and Essex's pilots were held back again, at least until being launched at 2:25 to chase the survivors down. Essex's Hellcats were once again the first to catch up with the enemy, this time as they arrived over a rote field on Guam. Dave McCampbell got to work again and downed 2 more fighters to give himself a total of 7 for the day. Including the slaughter over Guam in the morning, Japanese losses exceeded 350 planes on June 19th, while just 17 Hellcats had been lost to enemy action. Task Force 58 sailed west during the night in the hopes of attacking the Japanese at dawn. However, American searches early on the 20th found nothing. When the Japanese were finally found, it was after 3 p.m., and they were 275 miles away and moving due west at a speed of 20 knots. Admiral Mark Mitcher, commander of Task Force 58, decided to launch a late afternoon strike. Essex's pilots were held in reserve, though, and were not assigned to either strike. With the Battle of the Philippine Sea over and Japanese air power in the Marianas crushed, Essex got back to the business of supporting the Marines and GIs ashore. Until early August, her pilots pounded islands throughout the area in support of the ongoing operations to seize them. On August 26, 1944, Task Force 58 became Task Force 38 when Admiral William Halsey relieved Admiral Raymond Spruance of command. Essex was transferred to Task Group 38.3, and from September 6th to the 8th, she conducted strikes on the Palau Islands. She then attacked Japanese shipping and installations throughout the Philippines during the rest of September. Essex conducted strikes on Okinawa on October 10th, during which numerous Japanese transports, corvettes, patrol craft, and gunboats were sunk in Naha Harbor. Her task group then struck Formosa from the 12th through the 14th, and on the 15th, she covered a task group built around 2 heavy cruisers which had been damaged during air attacks over the previous days. As they retired eastward for repairs, they were being used by Admiral Halsey as bait to draw out the remaining surface elements of the Imperial Japanese Navy. Essex's group, along with Task Group 38.2, were waiting for the Japanese to make a move, but they didn't go for it, and her task group headed back to the Philippines after refueling on the 16th. She spent the next week supporting operations centered around the amphibious landings on Leyte. Just after 1 a.m. on October 23rd, the submarine USS Darter detected a Japanese surface force off the western coast of the Philippines. After striking targets around Luzon early on October 24th, Essex and her task group turned their attention to this force, which by now was churning up the Sibuyan Sea and heading for San Bernardino Strait. But before they could get a strike airborne, they were attacked by several waves of Japanese planes from Luzon, once again led by Commander McCampbell, who himself accounted for 9 aerial victories, which set the record for most in a day. The attackers were driven off by the combat air patrol. Finally, free to launch a strike, VB-15 Helldivers were part of the second strike and scored 10 hits on the Japanese battleship Musashi. As she withdrew, listing to port, a third wave from Enterprise, and Franklin hit her with an additional 11 bombs and 8 torpedoes. Musashi capsized and sank that evening. A little past 4:30 that afternoon, Task Force 38 located Japanese carriers to the north, but it was a decoy force consisting of 1 fleet carrier, 3 light carriers, and 2 hybrid battleship carriers, which could only muster 108 planes. The purpose of this force was to draw the main body of Task Force 38 far enough north so that they could not come to the aid of the forces covering the landing when the Japanese center and southern surface groups converged on the beachhead. Halsey took the bait and ordered his carriers, including Essex, north at flank speed to intercept what he believed to be the main threat. During the ensuing battle off Cape Engano the next day, Essex's pilots helped to destroy Japanese naval aviation once and for all. Most of their remaining aircraft were shot down, and the carriers Zuikaku, Chitose, and Zuiho, along with a destroyer, were all sent to the bottom with heavy losses of life. With the final major naval battle of the war over, Essex went back to conducting airstrikes until her task group was dispatched to replenish on October 30th. November saw more strikes throughout the Philippines, mostly around Luzon, and on the 25th she was hit on the edge of her portside flight deck by a kamikaze as she was attempting to launch a strike. She suffered minor damage to her flight deck, and flight operations were not hindered by it. 15 men were killed and 44 were wounded. Following quick repairs at Ulithi, she joined Task Group 38.1 to support the landings on Mindoro from December 14th to the 16th. She rode out Typhoon Cobra afterwards and conducted more strikes on Luzon until heading for Ulithi on December 23rd. Essex was underway again a week later and struck Formosa on January 3rd and 4th, before supporting the landings on Luzon from the 6th to the 10th, when she entered the South China Sea and spent the rest of the month attacking Japanese shipping there. Task Force 38 reverted back to Task Force 58 at the end of January, and Essex was reassigned to Task Group 58.3. She participated in strikes on the Tokyo area in mid-February before supporting the invasion of Iwo Jima, which was followed by more strikes on Tokyo. As the calendar turned to March, Essex turned her attention to the island of Okinawa. She subsequently spent the next several months alternating between supporting operations on Okinawa and conducting airstrikes throughout the Japanese home islands. Her pilots and gunners fought off many kamikazes during this period. After spending much of June in the Leyte area for upkeep, rest, and replenishment, Essex joined Task Force 38 for strikes on the home islands in July, which kept her pilots and crew busy right up to the Japanese capitulation on August 15, 1945. She continued defensive combat air patrols until September 3rd, when she was dispatched to Bremerton, Washington for inactivation. She arrived at the Puget Sound Navy Yard on September 15th. In January 1947, she was decommissioned and placed in the reserve fleet at Puget Sound. Beginning in early 1949, Essex was modernized. Her flight deck was reinforced to accommodate jet aircraft, as were her elevators. Her 5-inch twin mounts near her island were removed, and new twin 3-inch 50 caliber gun mounts replaced her quad 40 mounts. Her island was completely redesigned. In addition, the boiler uptakes were rebuilt and angled aft to accommodate a single radar and communications mast atop the island. To better protect air crews, ready rooms were moved from the gallery deck to below the armored hangar deck, with a large escalator on the starboard side amidships to move flight crews up to the flight deck. Electrical generating power and weapons stowage and handling facilities were also improved. Her armor belt was removed and blisters were fitted to the hull to compensate, widening her waterline beam. Her standard displacement increased to over 28,000 tons, and she now sat lower in the water with her maximum speed slightly reduced to 31 knots. Essex was recommissioned in January 1951, and after her shakedown cruise, she headed back to the Western Pacific. When war broke out on the Korean Peninsula in June, she became the flagship of Task Force 77. She patrolled and provided close air support for UN troops throughout her 2 deployments. After spending the next few years patrolling and training in the Western Pacific, she arrived at Puget Sound in July 1955 for another overhaul and modernization. She received an angled flight deck, a hurricane bow, and her aft elevator was moved to her starboard deck edge behind her island. Primary flight control moved to the aft end of the island, and air conditioning was added for her crew. With her modernization completed, she rejoined the Pacific Fleet in March 1956. She was sent to join the Atlantic Fleet in June 1957, and after making the long trek around Cape Horn, arrived at Mayport, Florida, on August 1st. She spent the rest of her career in the Atlantic, and in 1960, she was converted into an anti-submarine warfare support carrier and was homeported at Quonset Point, Rhode Island. In April 1961, Essex steamed out of Quonset Point on what was deemed a routine training cruise. After several days at sea, all their identifying markings were crudely obscured with flat gray paint. Unbeknownst to most of Essex's crew, they had been tasked to provide air support for the ill-fated Bay of Pigs invasion. The naval aviation part of the mission was aborted by President John F. Kennedy at the last moment, and her crew was sworn to secrecy. Later on, in 1961, Essex completed a cruise to Northern Europe with ports of call in Rotterdam, Hamburg, and Greenock. During the Hamburg visit, over 1 million visitors toured her. On her return voyage to the United States, she ran into a severe North Atlantic storm and suffered major structural damage. In early 1962, she went into dry dock at the Brooklyn Navy Yard for a major overhaul. She had just finished her 6-month-long overhaul and was at Guantanamo Bay Naval Base for sea trials when President Kennedy placed a naval quarantine on Cuba in October 1962 in response to the discovered presence of Soviet missiles. Essex spent over a month patrolling the Caribbean and returned home just before Thanksgiving. While conducting replenishment exercises with NATO forces on November 10, 1966, Essex collided with the submerged submarine Nautilus. Nautilus sustained extensive sail damage, but returned to port unassisted, while Essex had her hull opened and the ship's speed indicator equipment was destroyed. Essex subsequently reported to the Boston Naval Shipyard for an extensive overhaul and hull repairs. Then, on May 25, 1968, while Essex was underway in the Norwegian Sea, she was buzzed by a Soviet bomber. On the fourth pass, the plane's wing clipped the surface of the sea, and the aircraft went down. Essex launched rescue helicopters, but none of the crew on board survived. 3 bodies and some wreckage was recovered and transferred to a Russian destroyer. Essex then recovered the Apollo 7 crew on October 22 after their splashdown north of Puerto Rico. Essex was decommissioned on June 30, 1969 at the Boston Navy Yard and was struck from the Naval Vessel Register on June 1, 1973. She was sold for scrapping exactly 2 years later in 1975 and was broken up at Kearny, New Jersey. Essex was awarded 13 battle stars and a Presidential Unit Citation for her service during the Second World War, and she was awarded 4 battle stars for her service during the Korean War. Thank you for watching, and as always, if you enjoyed this video, please hit the like button, comment, and subscribe. It really helps us out, and we greatly appreciate it. Thank you for all your support over the last year. It really means a lot.